Hello, I'm Don MacGregor, and I want to share some insights for these changing times. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the way in which science and spirituality are basically converging around the issue of interconnectedness and oneness. As Dr. Jude Currivan says, science is now evidencing oneness. I'm an Anglican priest, recently retired from being a vicar of various parishes. But before I was a vicar, I was a science teacher, and bringing together those two sides of my life has always been an important part of my spiritual path. I've taught many school students the simple version of the nature of matter, with the nucleus of protons and neutrons, and electrons whizzing around in an orbit. I've taught about electricity being a movement of free electrons in metal, and actually neither of those are strictly true. At the same time, I was aware of this deeper level of elementary particles that are being discovered when I was teaching, that is, the quarks, leptons, gluons, muons and bosons, and that in reality, everything was tiny vortices of energy of different frequencies and strengths, and nothing was solid at all. And in reality, nothing is actually solid. It's really just interlaced patterns of energy, creating force fields that give us a feeling of the different textures to our sense of touch. And it's our eyes that receive the reflected light from these force fields and send the information to the brain, which then forms a mental image. And so, for instance, a table is pictured in our minds as something hard, brown, made of wood, and not just an incredibly complicated interlacing of energies and forces held in a pattern that came from the form of an oak tree. We don't see those forces and energies that are the real table. We just see and feel the shape interpreted by our mind. Equally, a flower, the image of a flower is formed in our brains from reflected light at different frequencies. The light's reflected off the flower according to the patterns of those minute vortices of energy that form the flower. Our eyes convert that light into an electrochemical message to the brain, which then works, according to our consciousness, to create colour and shape out of the light frequencies and give it a label, a flower or a daisy or a buttercup, whatever. And the brain is just the receptor and filter mechanism for our consciousness. The idea is that the reality as we see it is not how it actually is at all. Now, this is a huge leap for most people to take on board. It's as much of a shift for many scientists as it is for us ordinary folks. It actually became easier for me to understand as I gained a deeper understanding of theology and the perennial wisdom teachings that have come down through the ages. I could see from these teachings that there is an underlying information pattern, a divine matrix, if you like, which holds everything in being. And science is beginning to think along the same sorts of lines. But of course, many scientists are still stuck in the old way of thinking, the Newtonian paradigm, which says that consciousness is something which the brain creates. But at last, this materialistic scientific paradigm is beginning to shift. And it's shifting to the realization that the weight of evidence is pointing to consciousness as the prime mover from which everything emanates. So a stick hits the ball. How did the stick hit the ball? Well, it was moved by the hand. How did the hand move? Well, the arm moved it. What moved the arm? Well, electrochemical signals from the brain. What made those electrochemical signals? What was the stimulus for them? Well, our consciousness. Our consciousness. You know, as a science teacher for 13 years and as an Anglican priest for many more than that, I longed to see the day when there would be scientific theories that actually tied together science and spirituality. But I did doubt if it would ever happen and be accepted. But I think now we're at the beginning of that process. And a new story is emerging. A story of the acceptance that science and spirituality are not opposing worldviews, but are the two sides of the same coin. I firmly believe that they are actually converging, and recent cutting-edge science seems to be indicating to me that that is happening, and it's very exciting. So what is it that's happening? Well, in recent years, several scientific writers have presented the viewpoint that the universe is actually a cosmic hologram, an intricately interconnected system in a series of nested hierarchies of energy, repeating patterns with the same essence of information running through it all. Think, for instance, of those little Russian dolls, each one containing a smaller version, the patterns repeated at all levels, going up and coming down. And every doll is part of a bigger one and also contains a smaller one. And the universe consists of the same pattern at different levels, nested hierarchies. Do you remember the poem about fleas? It goes like this: big fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so on, ad infinitum. And the great fleas themselves in turn have greater fleas to go on, while these again have greater still, and so on. And that's the kind of principle which the universe seems to be working on. The ancient principle of as above, so below. From recent scientific discoveries, it appears that there are repeated patterns at all levels of existence in this physical world. Now, this developing view says that beyond energy, there is an informational domain out of which all reality is derived. The entire universe is like a projection emanating from this informational domain, which holds the pattern of all existence. And these informational patterns are repeated at all levels. Out of complexity, there is an intrinsic simplicity and innate wholeness to our universe. Now, some of the evidence for this is that the same patterns are found in a variety of natural phenomena. For instance, fractals are the patterns that can be seen in all sorts of natural structures. For example, underlying the irregularity of the coastline, you can also see them in ice crystals and in the complexity even of entire weather systems, but also in the corrosion patterns of metals, in the crystalline structures of superconductors, in the solar wind, and even in the structure of Saturn's rings. Even galaxies cluster in fractal patterns. And even more astonishing is that apparently cities grow in the same way as galaxies form. It's the same patterns at all levels of existence, whether it's natural or man-made. And of course, we are natural ourselves. The same patterns being seen even in the power and frequency of earthquakes, and in the power law that applies to conflicts and wars. It seems remarkable that these same patterns are there throughout the universe, unless there is some form of mind bringing it all into being. Those last two slides were taken from Dr. Jude Currivan, and many more examples are given in her book, The Cosmic Hologram. Now, when seen from this perspective, the universe does behave like a unified cosmic hologram, with form being brought into being according to the patterns held in the informational domain, guided by some form of universal mind or consciousness. From the macro to the micro, the same patterns exist, as if the informational domain, the cosmic mind, holds the pattern for everything. So gradually there is this new way of seeing the physical plane on which we dwell. This is moving us on from the materialistic viewpoint, which says that matter is all there is, and consciousness pops out of the brain when the brain is developed enough. The new science story says that consciousness, or mind, has to exist before matter. This book, Mind Before Matter, is a collection of essays by scientists from different disciplines, all saying that consciousness comes first. Now, people like Professor Amit Goswami have been saying this for years, since the late 80s, early 90s, that consciousness is the ground of being from which everything materializes at the quantum level, and that there is only one universal consciousness. Many famous names have said similar things much earlier. The Nobel Prize award-winning quantum physicist Erwin Schrödinger said, "Consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms. Consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else." Sir Arthur Eddington, one of the founding fathers of the new physics, said, "The stuff of the universe is mind stuff." Or astrophysicist Eric Jansch, he said, "God is not the creator, but the mind of the universe." Famous physicist and mathematician Sir Roger Penrose stated, "My position on consciousness, that is, demands a major revolution in physics. I've come to believe that there is something very fundamental missing from current science. Our understanding at this time is not adequate, and we're going to have to move to new regions of science." Basically, scientists can't really form a theory of consciousness at present. They don't really have the beginnings of an understanding of how electrochemical signals entering the brain give rise to the experience of smell, taste, sight, let alone emotions of love and hate and everything else. Mathematical reasoning, even philosophical reasoning. How does it happen? It's as if consciousness exists outside the known laws of the universe and reality as we know it. And maybe, just maybe, it will be the next scientific breakthrough that starts to join up the dots. So to recap, the latest scientific evidence is pointing towards our universe being a cosmic hologram. This exists as an informational domain at the surface of the universe and can be likened to a unified and finite thought form in the infinite mind of the cosmos. And hence the convergence of science and spirit begins. And as someone recently said, it is now rational to be spiritual. Now, Dr. Dean Radin is a senior scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma in California in the US. In his recent book, Real Magic, he said, "The bottom line is this. Throughout science and scholarship, a basic principle of perennial philosophy that consciousness is fundamental is slowly becoming acceptable to talk about. Within science, this notion tends to be cast into the more conventional language of information and mathematics, but the connection with consciousness is undeniable." And he continues, "After centuries of life-threatening suppression, the societal shift that now allows scientists and scholars to publicly discuss consciousness in a new light might seem like a trifling matter, but it is a positively astounding transformation." So what all this is saying is that the material world as we know it stems or emanates from a deeper level of information, like a universal mind. This information, they say, is held in some kind of digital form, and that all material matter has its origin in mind or consciousness. From a scientific viewpoint, the whole universe is the outpicturing of a universal informational domain, or mind, or cosmic consciousness. Depends what terminology you use. And this is truly the beginning of the coming together of science and spirituality. We're beginning to see the vision of a participatory universe in which everything is interconnected and interdependent, a seamless whole of mind stuff or consciousness. As Jude Currivan says in her book, we are each individuated microcosms of the holographic intelligence of our universe, and ultimately of the infinite and eternal mind of the cosmos. So I hope all this is ringing spiritual bells. Buddhism, for instance, uses a similar sort of image to describe the interconnectedness of all phenomena. It's called Indra's net. It goes like this: when Indra fashioned the world, he made it as a web, and at every knot in the web, a pearl is tied. Everything that exists or has ever existed, every idea that can be thought about, every piece of true information is a pearl in Indra's net. Every pearl is tied to every other pearl by virtue of the web on which they hang, and on the surface of every pearl is the reflection of every other jewel on the net. Everything that exists in Indra's web implies that all else exists. So the new story is that we are all part of the one consciousness which holds everything in being, permeates everything, and is the one life. It was St. Paul who said, God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. We are all one, not just with the rest of humanity, but with the whole of the biosphere, even the whole of the universe. We are one in that we are all drops in the ocean of divine consciousness that holds this universe in being. That's one way of looking at it. To quote Jude Currivan again, she said, "Consciousness isn't just something we have, it's what we and the whole world are." Now, this is what mystics and religious have been saying for millennia in their own language, their own understanding. And that understanding is based on human experience, something possible for all humanity. Not everyone has had that particular human experience, but for those who have, it's life-changing. What is it? Well, it's when we're taken up in a feeling and knowing of such awe and wonder that we know we are one with everything and are held in love. It's the mystical experience of being at one with the divine, unity awareness of oneness. It is a normal experience, a normal human experience, something possible for anyone to have given the right conditions. But then it is interpreted in the understanding of the time and the culture and the context of that person. So the articulation and explanation of these experiences tends to take on the clothing of the religious and moral system of the time. Now, the problem to my mind is that we can mistake the clothing for the inner human experience, which leads us to imagine differences in clothing, where actually no differences exist in the actual experience. So I'm going to take you through a number of quotes from sacred and inspired writings that show how this interconnected oneness has been said for thousands of years, said by a few, and maybe not heard by most, or if heard, not really believed. And yet now science is beginning to say the same, albeit in its own language of information, fractals, holographic projections, and very complicated mathematics. What it is saying is that there is an inherent oneness and unity to the whole of the universe, which seems to emanate from one source. Let's have a look. So going back to some of the earliest religious writers, we have the Indian Upanishads dating from various stages in the first millennia BC. In the beginning was only being, one without a second. Out of himself he brought forth the cosmos and entered into everything in it. There is nothing that does not come from him. Of everything he is the inmost self. Chandogya Upanishad. Of course, all these are written in the understanding of the time, very often with patristic language. So I'm not going to attempt to change everything to he or she. I'll just quote them as they come in the language they were written. The Svetasvatara Upanishad says, God is one, hidden in all beings, all-pervading, the self within all selves, watching over all doing, dwelling in all being, the witness, the perceiver, the single one, free from all qualities. The Buddha had his experience. He who experiences the unity of life sees his own self in all beings. And around the same time as the Buddha, middle 6th century BCE, in China was Lao Tzu. He said, can you dissolve your ego? Can you abandon the idea of self and other? Can you relinquish the notions of male and female, short and long, life and death? Can you let go of all these dualities and embrace the Tao without skepticism or panic? If so, you can reach the heart of integral oneness. Slightly later, in India, came the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna speaking says, the whole world is pervaded by me, yet my form is not seen. All things have their being in me, yet I am not limited by them. We come to the Hebrew scriptures. In the story of Moses in the burning bush, Moses was instructed to go back to Egypt to rescue the Israelites, and he asked, who shall I say sent me? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. Now the Hebrew understanding of this text is that God is all that is. God is all that is happening at every moment. God is I am, not a being, not even a supreme being, but beingness itself. The prophet Isaiah, one translation of chapter 45, verse 5 says, I am the one who is. There is nothing else. Of course, Jesus Christ was brought up in the Hebrew scriptures, and he said, may they be one as we are one, I in them, and you in me, that they may become completely one. Now that was in the Gospel of John in the Bible. But he also said in the suppressed Gospel of Thomas, from the Nag Hammadi texts that were discovered in the 1940s, which is now thought actually to contain some of the earliest sayings, even predating some of Paul's letters. Jesus says, I lift the stone and you will find me. Lift the stone and you will find me. Cleave the wood and I am there. Now, these are fascinating texts. As I've mentioned before, Paul said, himself. In God we live and move and have our being. It's all saying that God is isness. God is beingness. Now, a little later in the 2nd century, there was a Roman emperor called Marcus Aurelius, from 161 to 180. He was the last of the rulers traditionally known as the 5 good emperors, there were actually some, and has been called the philosopher. And he said this, an amazing statement: all things are linked with one another. This oneness is sacred. There is nothing that is not interconnected with everything else. For things are interdependent, and they combine to form this universal order. Remarkable insights from 1900 years ago. It could have been written yesterday. Later on, we reach the Christian mystics. There was one woman called Hildegard of Bingen, lived from 1098 to 1179. She was a German Benedictine abbess, a writer, a composer, a philosopher, a mystic, a visionary, a polymath. She was quite a woman. She said, I, that is God, am life itself, for I am the whole of life. Life is not torn from stones, it did not bud from branches, nor is it rooted in the generative power of the male. Little dig she gets in there. Rather, every living thing is rooted in me, for I am the life that remains the same through eternity. And she also said, everything that is in the heavens, on earth, and under the earth is penetrated with connectedness, penetrated with relatedness. Good for you, Hildegard. A little later on, Eckhart von Hochheim, commonly known as Meister Eckhart, he was a German theologian, lived until 1328. He was a philosopher and a mystic. And in his later life, he was accused of heresy, and he was brought before the local Dominican-led Inquisition and tried as a heretic by Pope John the 22nd. It seemed that he died before his verdict was received, quite fortunate for him, I think. And he said this, I will give you still another thought, which is yet purer and more spiritual. The kingdom of heaven is all in all. All is one, and all is ours. And around the same time, there was a Flemish mystic, Johann von Ruysbroek. He's virtually saying that the universe is holographic. When he says the image of God is found essentially and personally in all. Each of us possesses it whole, entire, and undivided, and all of us together do not possess it more than one person does alone. In this way, we are all one, intimately united in our eternal image, which is the image of God. It actually gives a whole new meaning to the verse in Genesis that says, so God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. If we are a holographic image of God, then we are a projection or emanation of the cosmic mind. And we share in that unity, as does the whole of creation. We are made in the same pattern. A little later, coming up to the 1700s now, in Ukraine, from the Jewish mystical tradition, the same emphasis is made that everything is God. Rabbi Meshulam Favish Heller, of somewhere that I can't pronounce, says there is nothing in the world other than God and God's emanated powers, which are a unity. Other than that, nothing exists. Although it seems that there are other things, everything is really God and the divine emanations. They're all saying the same. Coming up to more recent days, in the 19th century now, William James said, this overcoming of all the usual barriers between the individual and the absolute is the great mystic achievement. In mystic states, we both become one with the absolute and we become aware of our oneness. This is the everlasting and triumphant mystical tradition, hardly altered by differences of clime or creed. A little later than William James, Albert Einstein, whom we all know, great scientist, he wrote a private letter to a grieving friend, and he said this: "A human being is a part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." Now, these are only a short selection. There are many, many more. And this oneness is not just about humanity, it's about everything on this planet. It's all embracing. Science tells us that we are essentially vibratory patterns, interacting, communicating informational energies. And we are evolving into an awareness that oneness and compassion is the way ahead. The mystics and the seers and the pioneers have always been dancers on the edge with this idea, dancing on the edge of orthodoxy, trying to stay within its bounds. Otherwise, in the past, anyway, they could have been condemned as heretics and outcast, at worst, burnt at the stake, decapitated, or hung, drawn, and quartered. And they're on the edge because they've seen something which is hard to put into words, but which they know. It's totally seared into their hearts and minds. That we are one with the divine essence which permeates and holds everything. They couched their writings in acceptable terms for the times in which they lived. And from a religious perspective, people call this divine essence by different terms in different belief systems. God, Allah, Brahman, consciousness, soul, the source, the universe. Scientists are now beginning to call it the cosmic information field, or cosmic mind. The truth is, we are all one in this immense divine presence which sustains everything. And there is a deeper, broader philosophy which has been like an underground current throughout all religions and beliefs, and actually seems to undergird all existence. It goes by the name of perennial wisdom, or esoteric philosophy, or ageless wisdom. It is a perspective in spirituality that views all the world's religious traditions as sharing a single metaphysical truth or origin from which all esoteric and exoteric knowledge and doctrine has grown. All faiths have an aspect of it, and it's expressed in their own terminology. It has emerged in different times and cultures, from the ancient Egyptian mystery religions and the teachings of Pythagoras and Plato, to Hinduism and Buddhism, and in Christianity, and through so many modern-day channeled writings. In its expression via theosophy and the writings of Alice Bailey, we're given the nuts and bolts, the complicated, detailed, like architectural drawings of how it works. In the writings of people like Neil Donald Walsh, in his Conversations with God, we're given a down-to-earth outworking of some of the principles in people's lives. All the major faiths contain something of it, expressed in their own culturally bound understandings. I've begun to link it with my own understanding of Christianity in a series of books, the first being called Christianity Expanding into Universal Spirituality. And just to get the plug in, it's available to order online or in bookshops from November 2020. So there is a diverse energy stream of vibrational intelligence working throughout the universe, forming and unforming over eons of time. We could call it the mind of God, or we could see it as a sentient universe. Every aspect of human society and behavior is affected by it, from economics to education, from politics to transnational businesses, and to health and wholeness. In recent years, the sentient nature of this whole planet has come to the fore, using Gaia as a name. And we know that the more we distort the biosphere, the more Gaia will attempt to rebalance and restore itself, with possible dramatic and disastrous effects on ourselves. So I believe it is time for a new story to emerge, one which embraces the whole sphere of human endeavour and unites us in love and wisdom with this universal mind. For our future existence, we have to work together in this world to cooperate and collaborate and realise that we are all part of the one. It is a journey that we're all on, whether we know it or not. Those of us who are consciously on a spiritual path have a responsibility to hold to this truth that we are one interconnected whole with all beings. Thank you for listening.